So what does that do now to kind of pivot? Where does that leave the Sixers now? The Indiana Pacers 23-17, as the guys talked about. They're right there in the Eastern Conference. They're going to be a tough out in the postseason, but still a bit of a ways away, we think, for the Sixers. But for the Sixers to worry about what they've been worried about, which is the Milwaukee Bucks and the Boston Celtics, where do we go now? Because with two players off the board, both from Toronto, OG Anunoby to the Knicks, and now Pascal Siakam to the Indiana Pacers, the usual suspects are still there. Zach LaVine, Dejounte Murray, and other than that, it's more of those extra role player pieces that we don't hear as much about as of late, but those two names in LaVine and Murray are still out there big time. So right now with this move, is there a little more pressure now on Daryl Morey to get something done, not to do it because of these teams, but more so because of the names that we've talked about? If he has had interest in them, are now two of them off the board?
Well, it's kind of it hits you in two different spots, right? Like there are fewer, at least in terms of what we know,
sure,
of who's available. There are fewer quote unquote impact or close to impact guys available on the trade market right now. So, and we were originally going to do the show today about whether the Sixers should go all in, what that looks like, what you'd have to give up, et cetera, et cetera. But now I would say you're essentially down to, because LaVine, we've thrown cold water on over and over again.
By the way, the entire NBA has reportedly thrown cold water on
Correct.
LaVine as well. Yeah.
So you are essentially down to, is it worth pushing the chips in for Dejounte Murray? Because if not, you're not making a trade of a major caliber, I would say. It's not to say you can't make impactful moves, not to say you can't get good players, but Dejounte Murray is the big piece left on the board. And he's got interest from, as far as we can tell, several different teams. I wonder if there are any of the teams that were in on Siakam might pivot to, will we look at Murray? I would say no. Like Dallas was in on Siakam, and he doesn't fit there. That's Luka and Kyrie. And
It would be funny, though.
Oh, I mean, it'd be very funny to see what that would look like. So it becomes, I don't want to say Murray or bust, but it's Murray or it's a definite slide down the name scale for the Sixers. The other part of it is, how many free agents are left at this point that you even care about? And Derek has made this point many, many times about, there's been a lot of discussion about cap space from reporters, from fans, other people. Wouldn't put a ton of stock in that in terms of like, oh, that's the big thing the Sixers are doing. And I would even double down on that now. Like, other than making trades at the draft, which could be a big thing depending on how the season shakes out, there is not an obvious, like, they are going after this guy or they should go after this guy in free agency this summer, unless you believe that they're going to go after like LeBron, which just seems completely unrealistic. So I think this move, I don't want to say it boxes them in, but it definitely shrinks their options.
And folks, remember too that Kawhi Leonard signed his extension, who had a player option for the offseason, part of that free agent list that Kyle talks about. Paul George is another name that could opt out, but it seems after the Kawhi Leonard deal that they are also already in discussion.
I've been treating them like a package deal.
Exactly, to extend there. So to Kyle's point, Derek, Dejounte Murray is probably it in terms of if we're going to frame them, all-star names.
Yeah, see, it is fascinating because on one hand, I always said, like you mentioned, free agency to me was a third option. It was a last resort. It was a little bit of a threat, especially on someone like Siakam. Like, hey, we don't have to go all in now. We can, be patient, go in free agency, keep our assets. I don't think that was actually ever their priority, but it was a threat that you could make. But I always thought the top two priorities were getting someone in February, and if not, getting someone in a trade in June and July. Well, that trade is still there. Like having that cap space, not having those bad negative value contracts to weigh you down. You are more flexible in the trade market in June and July. Even if the players that you're targeting aren't necessarily free agents, you're waiting for that next player to become available. The problem with that theory, like you said, with free agency, you have a list of people who theoretically could be available. And once you get past deadline, they will become available. Trades, you don't know. You're waiting for something to shake up the status quo, and that's a very risky gamble to make. So it does, like with fewer free agency options, it does make you a little more, motivated to be aggressive at the deadline. But if your best option is someone like Murray, who I've questioned the fit of, it's going to be a real tough decision for Daryl to make. You kind of hope that there's somebody else who shakes through. I think right now, still, if I feel compelled that I have to make a move, that I'm not willing to wait for somebody to come available as a trade candidate in the draft or free agency, if I'm not comfortable with that uncertainty, I would still rather sort of like pursue like an Atlanta Bogdanovich and maybe one other piece than go all in on somebody who I don't believe in the fit of long term. But it is getting more and more difficult to hold your ground. It is.
Yeah, and we were discussing Murray some before the show, Murray's contract. The more that I have looked at him and the deal he's on, I'm not super concerned.
His contract is pretty low on my concern list. His fit.
The fit is real. Like, do you buy the shot? Is he going to buy into the role they need him to play? But the way I framed it prior to the show is like, if you send Marcus Morris and Melton and you get back to Dejounte Murray, I think that gives you a pretty significant upgrade in terms of your on-ball juice. And I think even if you were to say the catch and shoot stuff is a potential problem, buy into role, potential problem. Obviously, we've talked some too about thinking his defense is overrated and, what do you get out of him there? I still think in a playoff series where self-creation becomes so much more valuable than it is during a regular season stretch against good teams, I think Dejounte's value would eventually shine through there. And I think even if you can't recoup whatever value you give up for him in a trade prior to the deadline, I think you could at least get some value back. Like that contract he's making essentially the cap hit next year, I believe, is 25.5. It goes from 25.5, 27.5, 29.5, and then I'll have a player option for 31.5, and that's 2026, 7.
Kyle mathing on the spot.
7, 8. I'm just trying to remember. But at that point, that's less than 17% of the cap 4 years from now. That's nothing for a guy who I think is a pretty talented and ultimately pretty productive player in Murray. So if you could incentivize Atlanta to trade you him without giving up much in terms of the current players, and you say, we'll give you, I don't know what, 2 picks for that. I don't know what the price is going to end up being for him. I don't know where Atlanta sets that bar. I think that's probably worth it. Now, whether they will do that is up for debate. I know Shams reported today they're not really interested in him. I don't agree with that. I'd say at the current price, they're not in on trading for Murray, but I don't think it's like Levine where they don't want to touch that contract. That's been made clear for months and months. I think Murray, it's more of we're going to see how these next few weeks and the market shakes out and if anyone else becomes available. And that might be right before the deadline. Let's have a serious discussion about how close we are to winning a title.
We all silly like the mayor.